Hey folks, we're going to talk in this video about point buffing. And point buffing is a pretty powerful type of way to use mages in Dominions 5. Let's first cover what a point buff is. So most of you will probably be familiar, well, with point buffing, but you're also probably going to be familiar with normally how you would buff up a commander. Like I have a Melkort here. A lot of times with a Melkort, you'll do Earth Power, and then Iron Skin, and then Temper Flesh, and then maybe Blessing. All of these things, if you look at them, they target the caster, like so. Except for the Blessing. A point buff is basically something that... it's also called fluffing, which I won't explain why. But a point buff is basically something that doesn't target the caster. It's where you're going to be buffing up one of your friends. And in particular, it is a class of spells where the area of effect is 1, which means you're generally only buffing up one guy. Buffing up bigger squads is also, it's the same thing. It's buffing. But there is a big class of things which are accessible very early in research and only target area of effect 1. And that whole category of stuff is basically point buffing. So anyway, y'all are all familiar with this, and Melkorts are really strong when they run in with all of these things on them. Well, watch him run in and kill everything. And they don't need any gear. And they just run in and don't care about really anything. And you can see his fatigue is fine because he has summon earth power. His protection is super high, it's 28. He has very good attack and defense. He's a very scary Melkort. And so he is going to come back. Now, point buffing is something different. Point buffing will make something to cast our point buffs on. In this case, 27. I think what we are going, 16, 15. I think we're going to make 2 of these guys, and we're going to point buff. We're going to point buff them. So this is point buffing. Point buffing is instead of doing it on one guy, we are going to do it on, instead of doing it on ourselves, we're going to do it on somebody else. So in this case, we're going to put 2 units in the same tile, and we're going to put these guys behind them. And we're going to script these guys to buff these guys. And one of the things that's important about this is you have to understand how point buffs are going to target. And generally they target based on hit point density. And so because these guys have more hit points than my mages, they're typically going to target them. But we'll see if sometimes they're disobedient, which, those darn disobedient commanders. We're going to do Iron Warriors twice. And what that's going to do is it's first going to buff these guys with Iron Warriors, and then it's going to buff this guy with Iron Warriors. These guys, we need to tell them to hold and then attack. And this dude, we are going to script with, first we are going to do regeneration, and then we're going to do, I think then we're going to do enlarge. And you can see we can't cast regen. A lot of times when you're doing point buffing, you're going to want to use mages, which are pretty low path. Like you're not going to want, if I want to do regeneration, I don't want to put gear on somebody whose whole job is to probably buff somebody and then maybe die. So you can just throw a couple gems on. It gets a little bit expensive if you do this a lot, but it's generally kind of okay to do. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do Legions of Steel, and then we're going to cast spells. And I guess we'll do Temper Flesh while we're sitting here. The Temper Flesh is only going to go on him, but it will hopefully keep him alive. This guy's going to do Regen twice, Enlarge, and yeah, that should be okay. That should be okay. We're going to have him cast spells. And we're going to have them run in here. And this is basically how point buffing works. We'll see if it works. Sometimes it doesn't work, like your mage will get shot with an arrow. So let's watch this again. I want to see, we're going to go through this slowly. I went through it too fast. We're going to see the order in which and who they target. So he cast regeneration. You can see the effect. These guys just got the regen effect on them. All right, he cast Iron Warriors, and they targeted themselves with Iron Warriors. And I don't know the logic. It may have been that even though these guys have more HP density, they also have higher protection. So it may have decided that it's better to go after these guys who have 0 protection than it is to go after these guys, which probably actually is true, because when the arrows come in, there's a chance they kill the commanders. The second cast of Iron Warriors is not going to target these guys, because generally the AI is going to avoid targeting the same unit that already has a buff on it. So now it targets these guys. So now these guys are 27 protection with regen. And now they did Enlarge. And Enlarge is going to target these guys because of higher HP density. And now they're very big and scary. And they're going to run in very shortly. Now, there's some problems. We may lose our mages here, and that may cause an HP rout. This is not necessarily like an efficient setup, but this is just more to illustrate point buffing. These guys are fatigued out, so even though they have really high protection, they're still going to take a fair amount of damage in melee. And it seems to be working. You can see it can be strong, but it's like here I'm kind of like biting my nails watching this because it seems like we might die. Okay, anyway, that worked. We killed a reasonably large amount of PD, and in no ways is this how to do it. The point is that we can make a commander who never would be able to be the centerpiece of, you know, like a raid or something. We can get them strong enough with point buffing that they can do it. And the extension of this is if you take, you know, like if this guy had any gear, he actually could be strong, right? Rather than something we kind of threw together. So yeah, that's the basic idea behind point buffing and behind fluffing, is you're doing it generally on a small number of units, and so you've got a high mage to affected unit ratio, because you can only do it usually on one tile at a time, but you're making those very strong. The things it doesn't do well against are things that jump on the back line, or things that are going to hit extremely hard, because they're going to really disrespect your really high protection thugs or something. The next part of this, we're going to talk about what are all the point buff paths that are important. And there's a few that are really important. One of them is Astral. And in Astral, I guess let's go through these in the order we see at the top. Fire, there's not really any point buffing in Fire. Air, there's basically no point buffing in Air. You can do Gift of Flight, and that actually deserves special mention. And you'll just have to trust me on this, because I don't know a great way to show it to you. But I do. We'll see if it works. Okay, we're going to have all these guys go and attack, and we're going to have this guy do Gift of Flight. And it may target the Melkort, it may not. It should target the Melkort, because 2 of these guys in a tile is going to have less HP than a Melkort. So if we look, who does it target? Okay, so you can see it targeted these guys. It gave them flying. It didn't give it to the Melkort. Gift of Flight, I have no idea what the targeting is for it, but it is not targeting based on HP density. I think it's random, but it may be targeting on something completely... You know, there may be some variable it's targeting. I have no idea what it is. But that's really the only... I mean, you can do Windrunner and stuff too, but it's not really a thing. Gift of Flight, though, is the only one that's reasonably useful as an air fluff, I think. And it's basically an Area 1 effect. The only way to target this one precisely is to have nothing else near the Gift of Flight caster, except the unit you want to hit within about a range of 10. So that's a pretty weird way to get this working. But if you want to do it, that's how you do it. Anyway. That is air. Next up, we have water. Water has some interesting ones, and I don't have a water mage here, so I'll use the debug sensei. Water, they have quickness is the main one. So you can get quickness on some of your, your sacreds, or on a hero, or on a thug, or whatever it is. If you have a water 2 mage or a water 1 mage with a gem, you can put quickness on them. That is the main one. There is other stuff you can kind of do in water, like Wave Warriors is kind of nice, but it's area of effect 5. So, I don't know if it's technically point buffing. It's also kind of expensive to cast. And generally when you're doing point buffing things, you want to have low cost, easy, low cost mages doing easy to cast spells. That's kind of what it is. And Wave Warriors kind of breaks that because you're not going to need a water 3 or at least a water 2 with 2 gems. Yeah, I don't know. There's not much else for water, which is fine because Earth, we have quite a few things. Earth, as you can see, we did when we attacked down here. We have Iron Warriors, which is the main one. And this gives you Iron Skin, so 20 natural protection, or 3 if you already have that high natural protection. It's also going to give you a Shock Malus, and then we also have Legions of Steel, which is a big area of effect. This isn't really a point buff, but sometimes you'll use it that way. I think that's mostly it for Earth. The other things you can do in Earth that sometimes you'll do, but you're not often wanting to do, are you can point buff with Earth Might, which is going to give you strength, and you can point buff with where are we? You can point buff with Strength of Giants, which is down here. You can also point buff with Iron Will, and this actually deserves mention because it's actually pretty good. If you have a small group of guys you want to get +4 MR on, like more magic resistance, Iron Will is actually pretty economical, and it's basically just in one area of effect is going to give you +4 MR, so pretty cool. Yeah, that is Iron Will and Earth. I think we've covered most of the things here in Earth. And next up, we have Astral. And Astral is probably one of the better point buffing paths. And it's because you get a lot you can do. Very cheap. You get Body Ethereal, which you only need to be Astral 1. This is going to negate 75% of non-magic attacks. You get Luck, which is going to negate 75% of lethal attacks. Attacks that would have killed you. And then you get Cheat Fate, which is going to block the first attack. So you can, with one, like an Astral 1 mage can do a lot of point buffing. And that is kind of their thing. But that's it. That's kind of it for point buffing for Astral. There's more buffs you can do, but not really more point buffs. And that brings us next to Death. Death does not have any point buffing that I know of, so that's not really a thing. Nature. Nature has a few. Nature has more than you would think. A lot of people don't think of Nature as a good buffing path, but Nature is a pretty good buffing path. So I'm going to power on this guy in water real quick. So Nature, we get a few things we can do. We get Enlarge, which is going to make you it's going to make you bigger, +1 size. You get Moss Body, we Enlarge, +1 size. So that's 30% to HP, +3 strength, -1 defense, +2 map move. Map move obviously doesn't affect you in combat, so I can't even talk. For protection, we get basically an area of effect 1 protection spell, like Barkskin. And this is going to give Barkskin to everybody in one area of effect. And next up, we have Moss Body. Moss Body is going to basically, it's 75% of your hits are going to be reduced by 15 damage. If that is not enough to block the shot, then this thing will pop instead. And when it pops, it's going to release a cloud of poison. So if you have low protection units, then this is going to pop pretty regularly and cause a lot of poison damage, and then it's going to go away and they're going to take more damage. If you put this on high protection units, that won't happen, and instead they will be extremely hard to kill. This basically is like a 75% damage block if you have high protection. And anyways, that's Moss Body. We've talked about Enlarge and Protection. You have Wooden Warriors, which is not really a point buff anymore, but it's just a bigger area of effect protection. Coming down, we have Regeneration, which you saw me use earlier. This is basically an area of effect 1 regeneration buff. And then we also have Gift of the Hair, which will double combat speed, but these aren't usually that useful. One thing I haven't mentioned at all, because you can't really do it as part of point buffing, but you can do it as part of buffing, is all of the different wards. So an enchantment, usually enchantment 4 or 5, there's going to be a ward effect for like cold or fire or thunder or poison, which is going to give a large group of units, usually like 15 area of effect, 10 resistance. And I think with some of the other ones, it's lower. 1 second, let me check. Before I risk misspeaking. So Thunderfend, Thunder Ward is 5. So it's only 10 for poison. But anyway, like 5 for thunder. You can do this as part of a point buffing thing. Generally, you won't. Not for point buffing. That's normally like you're buffing up a whole army. Point buffing, you're usually focusing, even if it's part of an army, you're usually focusing on a very small squad of units. Okay, so we talked about Moss Body, we talked about Protection, we talked about Enlarge, we talked about Regen. That's a lot of things just for Nature. Nature is a pretty good point buffing path. I think a lot of times it gets written off. And then that brings us to Blood. And Blood does not have any point buffing that I can think of. It gets... it doesn't really, it gets, the only thing that would kind of qualify is it does get some buffs. It gets Reinvigoration, which gets rid of your fatigue. It gets damage reversal, which is somewhere down here, but that's Blood 9, so it's never really relevant in most games. And then you get Rush of Strength, which is relevant usually only at the end of the game. And then Hell Power. There are buffs in Blood, but there's not point buffs. So that's it. We've covered point buffing. But we haven't really talked about when to use it. If you look at it as a strategy, it is mage turn expensive, which means every time you use it, it's going to cost you a lot of research because all your mages could otherwise be in labs. So it's mage turn expensive, and it stacks well with each other, right? So generally the way buffs in games in general kind of work, but in Dominions probably especially, is the more buffs you put on a single unit, they don't stack linearly. They kind of stack exponentially, right? So, like if you have regen on a unit, it is going to live a little bit longer because it's going to regen a little bit. But if you have regen and protection, then the protection is going to make it live longer, but it's also going to reduce the incoming damage to maybe less than the regen value. So it's going to make it live a lot longer, which means it can do more damage. So a lot of these buffs end up kind of stacking together. So when you're doing point buffing, a lot of times you want to put... The trick with point buffing is usually not bringing a ton of units. It's bringing some units, enough to get point buffed, and to bring... Basically, how many units you can bring would be determined by your mages. One of the problems that you have with this high mage to unit ratio is that often you end up... with a very high... If your mages retreat, or if they get killed, because oftentimes they're softer than your units, that can sometimes cause your units to rout, which is not ideal. So that's kind of a problem with point buffing, is sometimes you can actually HP rout your own side if your units die, if your mages die, or if they run. So that's something to be cognizant of, which is not normally something you're worried about. Oh no, my mages routed my units. Normally it's my units routed my mages. So anyway, the reverse can happen with point buffing. And anyway, I think that's about it. I guess one thing I'll say is, because it's mage turn expensive, a lot of times it's more useful on the defense than it is on the offense. Because if you use it on the offense, you're basically going to have to shut down your research in the early game. But as you get later in the game, where spending a few mage turns for different raiding parties and stuff is not very important, it becomes much more kind of viable again to use aggressively. Anyway, that is it for point buffing. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I think it was kind of short, but hopefully to the point. And we will see you next time.